I think it must have been an Authie. Arnold nodded. We have trouble tracking Authies because they spend so much time in the trees. The Authies were an exception to the usual minute-to-minute control they maintained over the animals. The computers were constantly losing and picking up the Authies as they went into the trees and then came down again. What burns me, Hammond said, is that we have made this wonderful park, this fantastic park, and our very first visitors are going through it like accountants, just looking for problems. They aren't experiencing the wonder of it at all. That's their problem, Arnold said. We can't make them experience wonder. The intercom clicked, and Arnold heard a voice drawl. John, this is the NB over at the dock. We haven't finished offloading, but I'm looking at that storm pattern south of us. I'd rather not be tied up here if this chop gets any worse. Arnold turned to the monitor showing the cargo vessel, which was moored at the dock on the east side of the island. He pressed the radio button. How much left to do, Jim? Just the 3 final equipment containers. I haven't checked the manifest, but I assume you can wait another 2 weeks for it. We're not well berthed here, you know, and we are 100 miles offshore. You requesting permission to leave? Yes, John. I want that equipment, Hammond said. That's equipment for the labs. We need it. Yes, Arnold said, but you didn't want to put money into a storm barrier to protect the pier, so we don't have a good harbor. If the storm gets worse, the ship will be pounded against the dock. I've seen ships lost that way. Then you've got all the other expenses, replacement of the vessel, plus salvage to clear your dock. And you can't use your dock until you do. Hammond gave a dismissing wave. Get them out of there. Permission to leave, NB, Arnold said into the radio. See you in 2 weeks, the voice said. On the video monitor, they saw the crew on the decks, casting off the lines. Arnold turned back to the main console bank. He saw the land cruisers moving through fields of steam. Where are they now? Hammond said. It looks like the South Fields, Arnold said. The southern end of the island had more volcanic activity than the north. That means they should be almost to the Stegos. I'm sure they'll stop and see what Harding is doing. Stegosaur. As the land cruiser came to a stop, Ellie Sattler stared through the plumes of steam at the Stegosaurus. It was standing quietly, not moving. A jeep with a red stripe was parked alongside it. I have to admit, that's a funny-looking animal, Malcolm said. The Stegosaurus was 20 feet long, with a huge bulky body and vertical armor plates along its back. The tail had dangerous-looking 3-foot spikes, but the neck tapered to an absurdly small head with a stupid gaze, like a very dumb horse. As they watched, a man walked around from behind the animal. That's our vet, Dr. Harding, Regis said over the radio. He's anesthetized the stego, which is why it's not moving. It's sick. Grant was already getting out of the car, hurrying toward the motionless stegosaur. Ellie got out and looked back as the second land cruiser pulled up, and the 2 kids jumped out. What's he sick with? Tim said. They're not sure, Ellie said. The great leathery plates along the stegosaur's spine drooped slightly. It breathed slowly, laboriously, making a wet sound with each breath. Is it contagious? Lex said. They walked toward the tiny head of the animal, where Grant and the vet were on their knees, peering into the stegosaur's mouth. Lex wrinkled her nose. This thing sure is big, she said. And smelly. Yes, it is. Ellie had already noticed the stegosaur had a peculiar odor, like rotting fish. It reminded her of something she knew but couldn't quite place. In any case, she had never smelled the stegosaur before. Maybe this was its characteristic odor. And she had her doubts. Most herbivores did not have a strong smell, nor did their droppings. It was reserved for the meat-eaters to develop a real stink. Is that because it's sick? Lex asked. Maybe. And don't forget the vets tranquilized it. Ellie, have a look at this tongue, Grant said. The dark purple tongue drooped limply from the animal's mouth. The vet shone a light on it so she could see the very fine silvery blisters. Microvesicles, Ellie said. Interesting. We've had a difficult time with these stegos, the vet said. They're always getting sick. What are the symptoms? Ellie asked. She scratched the tongue with her fingernail. A clear liquid exuded from the broken blisters. Ugh, Lex said. Imbalance, disorientation, labored breathing, and massive diarrhea, Harding said. Seems to happen about once every 6 weeks or so. They feed continuously? Oh yes, Harding said. Animal this size has to take in a minimum of 500 or 600 pounds of plant matter daily just to keep going. They're constant foragers. Then it's not likely to be poisoning from a plant, Ellie said. Constant browsers would be constantly sick if they were eating a toxic plant. Not every 6 weeks. Exactly, the vet said. May I? Ellie asked. She took the flashlight from the vet. You have pupillary effects from the tranquilizer? She said, shining the light in the stegosaur's eye. Yes, there's a miotic effect. Pupils are constricted. But these pupils are dilated, she said. Harding looked. There was no question. The stegosaur's pupil was dilated and did not contract when light shone on it. I'll be damned, he said. That's a pharmacological effect. Yes. Ellie got back on her feet and looked around. What is the animal's range? About 5 square miles. In this general area? She asked. They were in an open meadow with scattered rocky outcrops and intermittent plumes of steam rising from the ground. It was late afternoon, and the sky was pink beneath the lowering gray clouds. Their range is mostly north and east of here, Harding said. But when they get sick, they're usually somewhere around this particular area. It was an interesting puzzle, she thought. How to explain the periodicity of the poisoning. She pointed across the field. You see those low, delicate-looking bushes? West Indian lilac. Harding nodded. We know it's toxic. The animals don't eat it. You're sure? Yes. We monitor them on video, and I've checked droppings just to be certain. The stegos never eat the lilac bushes. Melia azedarac, called Chinaberry or West Indian lilac, contained a number of toxic alkaloids. The Chinese use the plant as a fish poison. They don't eat it, the vet said. Interesting, Ellie said, because otherwise I would have said that this animal shows all the classic signs of Melia toxicity. Stupor, blistering of the mucous membranes, and pupillary dilation. She set off toward the field to examine the plants more closely, her body bent over the ground. You're right, she said. Plants are healthy. No sign of being eaten. None at all. And there's the 6-week interval, the vet reminded her. The stegosaurs come here how often? About once a week, he said. Stegos make a slow loop through their home range territory, feeding as they go. They complete the loop in about a week. But they're only sick once every 6 weeks. Correct, Harding said. This is boring, Lex said. Shh, Tim said. Dr. Sattler's trying to think. Unsuccessfully, Ellie said, walking further out into the field. Behind her, she heard Lex saying, Anybody want to play a little pickle? Ellie stared at the ground. The field was rocky in many places. She could hear the sound of the surf somewhere to the left. There were berries among the rocks. Perhaps the animals were just eating berries. But that didn't make sense. West Indian lilac berries were terribly bitter. Finding anything? Grant said, coming up to join her. Ellie sighed. Just rocks, she said. We must be near the beach because all these rocks are smooth. And they're in funny little piles. Funny little piles, Grant said. All over. There's one pile right there. She pointed. As soon as she did, she realized what she was looking at. The rocks were worn, but it had nothing to do with the ocean. These rocks were heaped in small piles, almost as if they had been thrown down that way. They were piles of gizzard stones. Many birds and crocodiles swallowed small stones, which collected in a muscular pouch in the digestive tract, called the gizzard. Squeezed by the muscles of the gizzard, the stones helped crush tough plant food before it reached the stomach, and thus aided digestion. Some scientists thought dinosaurs also had gizzard stones. For one thing, dinosaur teeth were too small and too little worn to have been used for chewing food. It was presumed the dinosaurs swallowed their food whole and let the gizzard stones break down the plant fibers. And some skeletons had been found with an associated pile of small stones in the abdominal area. But it had never been verified, and... Gizzard stones, Grant said. I think so, yes. They swallow these stones, and after a few weeks the stones are worn smooth, so they regurgitate them, leaving this little pile, and swallow fresh stones. And when they do, they swallow berries as well, and get sick. I'll be damned, Grant said. I'm sure you're right. He looked at the pile of stones, brushing through them with his hand, following the instinct of a paleontologist. Then he stopped. Ellie, he said, take a look at this. Put it there, babe. Right in the old mitt, Lex cried, and Gennaro threw the ball to her. She threw it back so hard that his hand stung. Take it easy. I don't have a glove. You wimp, she said contemptuously. Annoyed, he fired the ball at her and heard it smack in the leather. Now that's more like it, she said. Standing by the dinosaur, Gennaro continued to play catch as he talked to Malcolm. How does this sick dinosaur fit into your theory? It's predicted, Malcolm said. Gennaro shook his head. Is anything not predicted by your theory? Look, Malcolm said, it's nothing to do with me. It's chaos theory. But I notice nobody is willing to listen to the consequences of the mathematics, because they imply very large consequences for human life, much larger than Heisenberg's principle or Gödel's theorem, which everybody rattles on about. Those are actually rather academic considerations, philosophical considerations. But chaos theory concerns everyday life. Do you know why computers were first built? No, Gennaro said. Burn it in there, Lex yelled. Computers were built in the late 1940s because mathematicians like John von Neumann thought that if you had a computer, a machine to handle a lot of variables simultaneously, you would be able to predict the weather. Weather would finally fall to human understanding. And men believed that dream for the next 40 years. They believed that prediction was just a function of keeping track of things. If you knew enough, you could predict anything. That's been a cherished scientific belief since Newton. And chaos theory throws it right out the window. It says that you can never predict certain phenomena at all. You can never predict the weather more than a few days away. All the money that has been spent on long-range forecasting, about $500 million in the last few decades, is money wasted. It's a fool's errand. It's as pointless as trying to turn lead into gold. We look back at the alchemists and laugh at what they were trying to do, but future generations will laugh at us the same way. We've tried the impossible and spent a lot of money doing it. Because in fact, there are great categories of phenomena that are inherently unpredictable. Chaos says that? Yes. And it is astonishing how few people care to hear it, Malcolm said. I gave all this information to Hammond long before he broke ground on this place. You're going to engineer a bunch of prehistoric animals and set them on an island? Fine. A lovely dream. Charming. But it won't go as planned. It is inherently unpredictable, just as the weather is. You told him this, Gennaro said. Yes. I also told him where the deviations would occur. Obviously, the fitness of the animals to the environment was one area. This stegosaur is 100 million years old. It isn't adapted to our world. The air is different. The solar radiation is different. The land is different. The insects are different. The sounds are different. The vegetation is different. Everything is different. The oxygen content is decreased. This poor animal's like a human being at 10,000 feet altitude. Listen to him wheezing. And the other areas? Broadly speaking, the ability of the park to control the spread of life forms. Because the history of evolution is that life escapes all barriers. Life breaks free. Life expands to new territories. Painfully, perhaps even dangerously. But life finds a way. Malcolm shook his head. I don't mean to be philosophical, but there it is. Gennaro looked over. Ellie and Grant were across the field, waving their arms and shouting. Did you get my Coke? Dennis Nedry asked as Muldoon came back into the control room. Muldoon didn't bother to answer. He went directly to the monitor and looked at what was happening. Over the radio, he heard Harding's voice saying, "The Stego, finally, handle on now." "What's that about?" Muldoon said. "They're down by the south point," Arnold said. "That's why they're breaking up a little. I'll switch them to another channel. But they found out what's wrong with the Stegos. Eating some kind of berry." Hammond nodded. "I knew we'd solve that sooner or later," he said. "It's not very impressive," Gennaro said. He held the white fragment, no larger than a postage stamp, up on his fingertip in the fading light. "You sure about this, Alan?" "Absolutely sure," Grant said. "What gives it away is the patterning on the interior surface, the interior curve. Turn it over and you'll notice a faint pattern of raised lines, making roughly triangular shapes." "Yes, I see them." "Well, I've dug out 2 eggs with patterns like that at my site in Montana." "You're saying this is a piece of dinosaur eggshell?" "Absolutely," Grant said. Harding shook his head. "These dinosaurs can't breed." "Evidently they can," Gennaro said. "That must be a bird egg," Harding said. "We have literally dozens of species on the island." Grant shook his head. "Look at the curvature. The shell is almost flat. That's from a very big egg. And notice the thickness of the shell. Unless you have ostriches on this island, it's a dinosaur egg." "But they can't possibly breed," Harding insisted. "All the animals are female." "All I know," Grant said, "is that this is a dinosaur egg." Malcolm said, "Can you tell the species?" "Yes," Grant said. "It's a velociraptor egg." Control. "Absolutely absurd," Hammond said in the control room, listening to the report over the radio. "It must be a bird egg. That's all it can be." The radio crackled. He heard Malcolm's voice. "Let's do a little test, shall we? Ask Mr. Arnold to run one of his computer tallies." "Now?" "Yes, right now. I understand you can transmit it to the screen in Dr. Harding's car. Do that too, will you?" "No problem," Arnold said. A moment later, the screen in the control room printed out, "Total animals, 238. "I hope you're satisfied," Hammond said. "Are you receiving it down there on your screen?" "We see it," Malcolm said. "Everything accounted for as always." He couldn't keep the satisfaction out of his voice. "Now then," Malcolm said, "can you have the computer search for a different number of animals?" "Like what?" Arnold said. "Try 239. "Just a minute," Arnold said, frowning. A moment later, the screen printed, "Total animals, 239. Hammond sat forward. "What the hell is that?" "We picked up another copy." "From where?" "I don't know." The radio crackled. "Now then, can you ask the computer to search for, let us say, 300 animals?" "What is he talking about?" Hammond said, his voice rising. 300 animals? What's he talking about?" "Just a minute," Arnold said. "That'll take a few minutes." He punched buttons on the screen. The first line of the totals appeared. Total animals, 239. "I don't understand what he's driving at," Hammond said. "I'm afraid I do," Arnold said. He watched the screen. The numbers on the first line were clicking. Total animals, 244. 244, Hammond said. What's going on? The computer is counting the animals in the park, Wu said. All the animals. I thought that's what it always did. He spun. Nedry, have you screwed up again? No, Nedry said, looking up from his console. Computer allows the operator to enter an expected number of animals in order to make the counting process faster. But it's convenience, not a flaw. He's right, Arnold said. We just always used the base count of 238 because we assumed there couldn't be more. Total animals, 262. Wait a minute, Hammond said. These animals can't breed. The computer must be counting field mice or something. I think so too, Arnold said. It's almost certainly an error in the visual tracking. But we'll know soon enough. Hammond turned to Wu. They can't breed, can they? No, Wu said. Total animals, 270. Where are they coming from? Arnold said. Damned if I know, Wu said. They watched the numbers climb. Total animals, 283. Over the radio, they heard Gennaro say, Holy shit, how much more? And they heard the girl say, I'm getting hungry. When are we going home? Pretty soon, Lex. On the screen, there was a flashing error message. Error. Search params, 300 animals not found. An error, Hammond said, nodding. I thought so. I had the feeling all along there must be an error. But a moment later, the screen printed. Total animals, 292. The radio crackled. Now you see the flaw in your procedures, Malcolm said. You only tracked the expected number of dinosaurs. You were worried about losing animals, and your procedures were designed to advise you instantly if you had less than the expected number. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was, you had more than the expected number. Christ, Arnold said. There can't be more, Wu said. We know how many we've released. There can't be more than that. Afraid so, Henry, Malcolm said. They're breeding. No. But even if you don't accept Grant's eggshell, you can prove it with your own data. Take a look at the Compy height graph. Arnold will put it up for you. Notice anything about it? Malcolm said. It's a Gaussian distribution, Wu said. Normal curve. But didn't you say you introduced the Compies in 3 batches? At 6-month intervals? Yes. Then you should get a graph with peaks for each of the 3 separate batches that were introduced, Malcolm said, tapping the keyboard. Like this. But you didn't get this graph, Malcolm said. The graph you actually got is a graph of a breeding population. Your Compies are breeding. Wu shook his head. I don't see how. They're breeding. And so are the Othnielia, the Myosaurs, the Hypsies, and the Velociraptors. Christ, Muldoon said. There are raptors free in the park. Well, it's not that bad, Hammond said, looking at the screen. We have increases in just 3 categories. Well, 5 categories. Very small increases in 2 of them. What are you talking about? Wu said loudly. Don't you know what this means? Of course I know what this means, Henry, Hammond said. It means you screwed up. Absolutely not. You've got breeding dinosaurs out there, Henry. But they're all female, Wu said. It's impossible. There must be a mistake. And look at the numbers. A small increase in the big animals, the Myosaurs and the Hypsies, and big increases in the number of small animals. It just doesn't make sense. It must be a mistake. The radio clicked. Actually not, Grant said. I think these numbers confirm that breeding is taking place in 7 different sites around the island. breeding sites. The sky was growing darker. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Grant and the others leaned in the doors of the Jeep, staring at the screen on the dashboard. Breeding sites? Wu said over the radio. Nests, Grant said. Assuming the average clutch is 8 to 12 hatching eggs, these data would indicate the compies have 2 nests. The raptors have 2 nests. The Aussies have 1 nest. And the Hypsies and the Mayas have 1 nest each. Where are these nests? We'll have to find them, Grant said. Dinosaurs build their nests in secluded places. But why are there so few big animals? Wu said. If there is a Maya nest of 8 to 12 eggs, there should be 8 to 12 new Mayas, not just 1. That's right, Grant said. Except that the raptors and the compies that are loose in the park are probably eating the eggs of the bigger animals, and perhaps eating the newly hatched young as well. But we've never seen that, Arnold said over the radio. Raptors are nocturnal, he said. Is anyone watching the park at night? There was a long silence. I didn't think so, Grant said. It still doesn't make sense, Wu said. You can't support 50 additional animals on a couple of nests of eggs. No, Grant said. I assume they're eating something else as well. Perhaps small rodents, mice and rats? There was another silence. Let me guess, Grant said. When you first came to the island, you had a problem with rats. But as time passed, the problem faded away. Yes, that's true. And you never thought to investigate why? Well, we just assumed, Arnold said. Look, Wu said, the fact remains, all the animals are female. They can't breed. Grant had been thinking about that. He had recently learned of an intriguing West German study that he suspected held the answer. When you made your dinosaur DNA, Grant said, you were working with fragmentary pieces, is that right? Yes, Wu said. In order to make a complete strand, were you ever required to include DNA fragments from other species? Occasionally, yes, Wu said. It's the only way to accomplish the job. Sometimes we included avian DNA from a variety of birds, and sometimes reptilian DNA. Any amphibian DNA, specifically frog DNA? Possibly. I'd have to check. Check, Grant said. I think you'll find that holds the answer. Malcolm said, frog DNA? Why frog DNA? Gennaro said impatiently, listen, this is all very intriguing, but we're forgetting the main question. Have any animals gotten off the island? Grant said, we can't tell from these data. Then how are we going to find out? There's only one way I know, Grant said. We'll have to find the individual dinosaur nests, inspect them, and count the remaining egg fragments. From that, we may be able to determine how many animals were originally hatched, and we can begin to assess whether any are missing. Malcolm said, even so, you won't know if the missing animals are killed or dead from natural causes, or whether they've left the island. No, Grant said, but it's a start. And I think we can get more information from an intensive look at the population graphs. How are we going to find these nests? Actually, Grant said, I think the computer will be able to help us with that. Can we go back now? Lex said. I'm hungry. Yes, let's go, Grant said, smiling at her. You've been very patient. You'll be able to eat in about 20 minutes, Edwidge said, starting toward the 2 land cruisers. I'll stay for a while, Ellie said, and get photos of the stego with Dr. Harding's camera. Those vesicles in the mouth will have cleared up by tomorrow. I want to get back, Grant said. I'll go with the kids. I will too, Malcolm said. I think I'll stay, Gennaro said, and go back with Harding in his Jeep with Dr. Sattler. Fine, let's go. They started walking. Malcolm said, why exactly is our lawyer staying? Grant shrugged. I think it might have something to do with Dr. Sattler. Really? the shorts, you think? It's happened before, Grant said. When they came to the land cruisers, Tim said, I want to ride in the front one this time with Dr. Grant. Malcolm said, unfortunately, Dr. Grant and I need to talk. I'll just sit and listen. I won't say anything, Tim said. It's a private conversation, Malcolm said. Tell you what, Tim, Ed Regis said. Let them sit in the rear car by themselves. We'll sit in the front car and you can use the night vision goggles. Have you ever used night vision goggles, Tim? They're goggles with very sensitive CCDs that allow you to see in the dark. Neat, he said, then moved toward the first car. Hey, Lex said. I want to use it too. No, Tim said. No fair. No fair! You get to do everything, Timmy! Ed Regis watched them go and said to Grant, I can see what the ride back is going to be like. Grant and Malcolm climbed into the second car. A few raindrops spattered the windshield. Let's get going.